The photograph stares back at me from the dusty album. 5 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, rifles at their sides, faces etched with that peculiar mixture of pride and weariness that only men who have seen battle can truly wear. November 1918. The war to end all wars was drawing to its bloody conclusion. These 5 men, immortalized in sepia tones, tell a story that has remained hidden for over a century. I trace my finger across their faces, names scrawled in faded ink beneath each figure. Left to right, Private Thomas Jenkins, Lieutenant William Harrison, Sergeant James Cooper, Corporal Henry Dawson, and Private Michael O'Brien, 5 soldiers from the 107th Infantry Regiment, 27th Division, American boys sent to the blood-soaked fields of France. But something isn't right. The date marked on the back reads November 8, 1918, just 3 days before the armistice, 3 days before the guns fell silent. And yet, as I examine Lieutenant Harrison's uniform, the second soldier from the left, details emerge that shouldn't be there. Details that send a chill down my spine. My grandfather was obsessed with this photograph. He'd inherited it from his father, who had served in the Great War. "There's more to this picture than meets the eye," he would say, his gnarled finger tapping at Lieutenant Harrison's chest. "Look closely at the second man. His uniform tells a story nobody was meant to know. And now, having spent years studying military history, I finally understand what my grandfather meant. The story of these 5 men, and the secret hidden in plain sight, deserves to be told. The journey begins in the archives of the 27th Division. Newspaper clippings, field reports, letters home, fragments of lives cut short or forever altered by the machinery of war. I find mention of 4 of the 5 soldiers. Jenkins, Cooper, Dawson, and O'Brien all appear in the regimental records. But Lieutenant William Harrison, he's a ghost. No service record, no mention in dispatches. Nothing to suggest he ever existed beyond this single photograph. The first breakthrough comes from a letter written by Private Thomas Jenkins to his mother in Brooklyn, dated October 2nd, 1918. "We've been assigned a new lieutenant today. William Harrison is his name. Transferred in from the 30th Division. Quiet sort of fellow. Keeps to himself mostly. The boys don't quite know what to make of him yet, but he seems capable enough. Strange times call for strange companions, I suppose. The 30th Division?" I cross-reference the records. No Lieutenant William Harrison served with the 30th. The mystery deepens. In early September 1918, the American forces were preparing for what would become known as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest and bloodiest operation of the American Expeditionary Forces during the war. The 107th Infantry would be thrust into the heart of this inferno, tasked with breaking through the Hindenburg Line. I find a field report from Captain Edward Miller, commanding officer of Company B, 107th Infantry, dated September 20th, 1918. Replacement officers arrived today to fill gaps left by casualties sustained during recent engagements. Among them, Lieutenant William Harrison, who brings much-needed experience from the 30th Division. His knowledge of German positions will prove invaluable in the coming offensive. How did Captain Miller believe Harrison came from the 30th Division when no such officer existed in their records? The question nags at me as I continue my research. The 107th Infantry Regiment suffered catastrophic losses during the assault on the Hindenburg Line in late September. Over 300 men killed in a single day. Among the dead was Captain Miller. His replacement, Captain Lawrence Wilson, makes no mention of Lieutenant Harrison in subsequent reports. It's as if the mysterious officer had vanished from official documentation, but he hadn't vanished from the regiment itself. Private Michael O'Brien, the 5th soldier in the photograph, kept a diary throughout his service. His entry from October 12, 1918, proves revealing. "Harrison led us on a night raid. Nerves of steel, that one. Knew exactly where the German machine gun nests were positioned. Got us in and out without a single casualty. The boys are starting to warm to him, though he still keeps his distance. Something haunted about his eyes, like he's seen more of this war than any man should." The pages of O'Brien's diary tell of Harrison's uncanny ability to navigate no man's land, his precise knowledge of enemy positions, his fluency in German that allowed him to interpret captured documents. He was, by all accounts, an exceptional officer, yet something about Harrison troubled O'Brien. In an entry dated October 25, 1918, he writes, "Caught the lieutenant speaking German in his sleep last night. Perfect accent, the kind you don't get from classroom learning. When I mentioned it this morning, he looked at me like I'd caught him with his hand in the cookie jar. Picked it up from prisoners, he said, but there's something in his manner that doesn't sit right. As October turned to November, the German forces were in retreat. The end of the war seemed finally within reach. The 5 soldiers in the photograph found themselves billeted in an abandoned farmhouse near the village of Stenay, just days before the armistice would be signed. I discover a bundle of letters from Corporal Henry Dawson to his wife in Connecticut. His letter from November 6, 1918 contains a passage that makes my pulse quicken. "We captured a German officer yesterday. Young fellow, barely old enough to shave. When they brought him in for questioning, the strangest thing happened. He took one look at Lieutenant Harrison and went white as a sheet, started jabbering in German, pointing at Harrison. None of us could make heads or tails of it except Harrison himself, who looked like he might be sick. He insisted on interrogating the prisoner alone. When they emerged an hour later, Harrison said the fellow had mistaken him for someone else. The German was shipped to the rear, and Harrison hasn't been the same since. What had the German officer seen? What had transpired in that hour-long interrogation? The photograph, taken just 2 days later, shows nothing unusual in Harrison's expression, the same stoic determination shared by his comrades. But his uniform tells a different story. I enlarged the photograph, focusing on the details of Lieutenant Harrison's jacket, the insignia on his collar, the placement of his buttons, the cut of his pockets, all regulation U.S. Army officer's uniform at first glance. But there's something subtly wrong about the stitching around his shoulder boards, as if they'd been removed and reattached. And the buttons? American officers' buttons bore the eagle emblem, but Harrison's appear smoother, their details less distinct in the photograph. The realization hits me with the force of an artillery shell. I'm not looking at minor discrepancies or wear and tear. I'm looking at a modified German officer's tunic, carefully altered to pass as American. William Harrison was not who he claimed to be. The final pieces of the puzzle come from an unexpected source. In a collection of battlefield souvenirs at a small museum in Pennsylvania, I discover a leather wallet. The label identifies it as having belonged to Sergeant James Cooper of the 107th Infantry, the third man in the photograph. Inside, folded and yellowed with age, is a handwritten note. "If anything should happen to me, find Captain Anderson of Military Intelligence. Tell him about Harrison. Tell him what we discovered. He will know what to do." The note is dated November 10, 1918, 1 day before the armistice and 2 days after the photograph was taken. What had Cooper and perhaps the others discovered, and what had happened in those final days of the war? The answers lie in the last entries of Private O'Brien's diary and a classified intelligence report I uncover in the National Archives, only recently declassified after a century of secrecy. O'Brien's diary, November 9, 1918. Harrison disappeared last night, just vanished without a word. Jenkins thinks he went to headquarters with dispatches, but Cooper and Dawson have been whispering together all morning. Something's afoot, and they're not sharing it with the rest of us. On November 10, 1918. Cooper finally told me and Jenkins what they suspect. It's so outlandish I can hardly bring myself to write it down. They believe Harrison is a German. Not just any German, but a member of their intelligence service. They found his real papers hidden in the lining of his bedroll. Identity documents for one Wilhelm Hartzmann, Oberleutnant in the Imperial German Army. Cooper says the patch job on his uniform should have been a giveaway. He's gone to find the captain, to report what they've discovered. And the final entry, written in a shaky hand on November 11, 1918, the day the armistice was signed. Cooper never returned. Dawson went looking for him last night and came back alone, white as a ghost. Said he found Cooper's body in the woods, throat cut. We reported it to the new captain, but with the armistice being signed, everything's in chaos. Jenkins thinks we should keep quiet about Harrison. War's over, he says. Let the dead bury the dead. But if Cooper was right, if Harrison really was a German spy, how many of our boys died because of information he passed along? How do we just let that go? The intelligence report fills in the blanks. Dated December 3, 1918. It's a summary of an investigation into the death of Sergeant James Cooper and the disappearance of Lieutenant William Harrison. Investigation concludes that the individual identifying himself as Lieutenant William Harrison, real identity, Wilhelm Hartzmann, German military intelligence, successfully infiltrated the 107th Infantry Regiment in September 1918. Evidence suggests Hartzmann had been operating behind Allied lines for several months, using identities of deceased officers to move between units. Sergeant Cooper discovered Hartzman's true identity on or about November 9th. Cooper was found deceased on November 10th, cause of death determined to be homicide. Hartzman disappeared on the night of November 9th and is presumed to have returned to German lines during the confusion preceding the armistice. Of note, intelligence gathered from captured German documents suggests Hartzman's mission was to gather information on American troop movements for a planned German counteroffensive in early 1919. The signing of the armistice rendered this intelligence moot. Recommendation: classification of this incident as top secret. No further action to be taken due to cessation of hostilities. The photograph takes on new meaning now. 5 soldiers, 4 Americans, and 1 German spy in disguised uniform, standing together just days before one would murder another and vanish into the mists of history. But the story doesn't end there. Further research reveals that Private Thomas Jenkins, Private Michael O'Brien, and Corporal Henry Dawson all survived the war. They returned home, carried on with their lives, and never spoke publicly about Lieutenant William Harrison or the fate of Sergeant Cooper. The official record listed Cooper as killed in action on November 10, 1918, one of the last American casualties of the Great War. Yet the truth remained hidden in that photograph, in the uniform of the second soldier from the left, a German wolf who had walked among American sheep, whose deception was nearly perfect. But for the small details of his hastily modified uniform, what became of Wilhelm Hartzman after the war? Here, the historical record grows murky. There's no mention of anyone by that name in German military records from the post-war period. Perhaps he, like many soldiers on both sides, simply disappeared into civilian life, carrying his secrets to the grave, or perhaps not. In a Berlin newspaper from 1933, I find a small photograph accompanying an article about the rise of the Nazi Party. It shows a group of men in civilian clothes standing behind a speaker at a rally. My eye is drawn to a figure in the background, older, gray at the temples, but with the same watchful eyes as Lieutenant Harrison. The caption identifies him as Wilhelm Hartmann, 1 Z missing from the spelling, a decorated veteran and party supporter. Could it be the same man? The quality of the newspaper photograph makes positive identification impossible, but the coincidence is striking. The trail grows cold after that. If Wilhelm Hartzmann survived the Great War only to join the architects of the Second, his ultimate fate remains unknown. Another ghost in a century haunted by millions. I return to the photograph of the 5 soldiers. Their expressions betray nothing of what was to come. The murder, the betrayal, the secrets. They stand proud in that moment, frozen in time. Comrades in arms despite the wolf in their midst. Jenkins, the loyal private who chose silence. Harrison, the spy who wore his enemy's uniform. Cooper, the sergeant who discovered the truth and paid with his life. Dawson, the corporal who found his friend's body. O'Brien, the private whose diary preserved the truth. 5 soldiers in 1918, standing proud. Their story, a tale of deception, murder, and secrets buried for a century, revealed only when you examine the second one's uniform. In the fading light of my study, I carefully place the photograph back in its album. The war to end all wars ended over 100 years ago, but its shadows still stretch into our present. And sometimes, the most revealing historical documents are not the official records or the general's memoirs, but a simple photograph of 5 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, 3 days before the guns fell silent. I close the album, but the faces of those 5 men linger in my mind, particularly Harrison, or Hartzmann, the spy whose nearly perfect disguise was betrayed by the subtle details of his uniform. His story represents a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were not rifles and bayonets, but deception and disguise. The Great War transformed the world and everyone caught in its machinery. It redrew maps, toppled empires, and scarred a generation. But beyond the grand historical narratives are countless smaller stories, tales of individual courage, horror, and moral complexity that rarely make it into history books. The story of these 5 soldiers and the secret hidden in the second one's uniform is just one such tale, a footnote in the vast chronicle of the war. Yet it captures something essential about the conflict itself, the blurred lines between friend and enemy, the moral compromises forced by circumstance, the thin veneer of civilization stretched to breaking point. To truly understand history, we must look beyond the broad strokes of dates and battles. We must examine the details, like those of a modified German officer's uniform worn by a spy among American soldiers. For it is in these details that the full human dimension of historical events reveals itself. I wonder what became of the other 3 soldiers after they returned home. Did they carry the secret of Harrison's true identity and Cooper's murder with them through their civilian lives? Did they ever consider coming forward with the truth? Private Thomas Jenkins returned to Brooklyn after the war. City directories show he worked as a mechanic, married in 1921, and raised 3 children. His obituary from 1972 mentions his service with the 107th Infantry, but says nothing of Lieutenant Harrison or the events of November 1918. Did he take those secrets to his grave, or did he confide in someone, perhaps his wife or children, in his final years? Corporal Henry Dawson's path is better documented. He returned to Connecticut, used his veterans' benefits to attend college, and eventually became a high school history teacher. There's a certain irony there. A man who witnessed a secret chapter of history teaching the official version to generations of students. His papers, donated to a local historical society after his death in 1980, contain no mention of Harrison or Cooper's murder. But they do include a curious item, a small piece of fabric, carefully preserved between sheets of acid-free paper. It appears to be a scrap of military uniform cloth, with no explanation of its significance. Could it be a piece of Harrison's modified German uniform, kept as a tangible reminder of the deception Dawson had witnessed? Private Michael O'Brien's post-war life took a different turn. He never returned to his hometown in Massachusetts. Instead, after his discharge, he moved to Washington, D.C., where records show he found employment with the War Department. The nature of his work is not specified in public documents, but given his first-hand experience with a German spy, one wonders if O'Brien's talents were put to use in the emerging field of counterintelligence. He died relatively young in 1947, leaving no known descendants. As for Wilhelm Hartzmann, his trail after the Berlin newspaper photograph of 1933 disappears into the chaos of World War II and its aftermath. If he was indeed the man pictured at that Nazi rally, he would have been in his 40s when the Second World War began. Did he serve the Third Reich as he had served the Kaiser? Did he survive the war? Or did he perish in the collapse of Hitler's Germany? The answers, if they exist at all, remain buried in archives not yet opened to researchers like myself. The story of these 5 soldiers, 4 Americans and 1 German spy, encapsulates the shadowy world of military intelligence that emerged during the Great War. Prior to 1914, espionage had been a relatively primitive affair. The technological and organizational demands of modern warfare changed that forever. Both sides deployed networks of spies, developed sophisticated codes, and engaged in elaborate deception operations. Hartzmann's infiltration of American units was likely part of a larger German intelligence effort to gather information on Allied capabilities and intentions. What makes his case particularly remarkable is the audacity of his disguise. To pose as an American officer required not just fluent English and knowledge of military protocols, but the confidence to carry off the deception face-to-face with actual Americans, day after day, in the most stressful circumstances imaginable. One slip, one inconsistency in his backstory, one cultural reference not understood, and Hartzmann would have faced a firing squad. The modified uniform that ultimately betrayed him represents both the attention to detail that made his deception possible and the small imperfections that left traces for the observant to discover. Cooper, who found Hartzmann's papers and recognized the alterations to his uniform, paid with his life for his powers of observation. I've spent years researching this case, following trails through archives on both sides of the Atlantic, piecing together fragments of evidence to reconstruct events that the official histories omit. My grandfather's obsession with the photograph has become my own. Sometimes I wonder if I'm seeing connections that aren't there, creating patterns from random events to satisfy my need for narrative closure. But then I look again at the photograph. 5 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, and in the uniform of the second man from the left, the subtle discrepancies that tell a story of deception, murder, and secrets kept for a century. The historical record is never complete. It is full of gaps and silences, stories untold or actively suppressed. The official narrative of the Great War, with its emphasis on generals and battles, treaties and territories, leaves little room for the William Harrisons of the conflict, men who fought in the shadows, whose victories and defeats were recorded in no dispatches. Yet their stories matter. They remind us that history is not just about grand forces and movements, but about individuals making choices, sometimes heroic, sometimes horrific, under circumstances most of us can barely imagine. They remind us that the neat categories of ally and enemy blur at the edges, that the fog of war obscures moral certainties as surely as it obscures battlefield visibility. The 5 soldiers in the photograph could not know that their image would survive for over a century, or that a historian would one day scrutinize the details of their uniforms to uncover a hidden story of espionage and murder. They were simply men caught in the machinery of history, trying to survive, to do their duty as they understood it, to maintain some semblance of humanity amid the industrialized slaughter of modern warfare. When I began this investigation, I hoped to find some final resolution, perhaps a deathbed confession from one of the surviving soldiers, or a definitive record of Hartzman's fate. I've found neither. The story remains incomplete, the full truth perhaps lost forever. But in another sense, this unresolved quality makes the story a more accurate reflection of history itself, which rarely offers the neat conclusions we crave. History is messy, ambiguous, subject to constant reinterpretation as new evidence emerges, or existing evidence is seen in a new light. The photograph of 5 soldiers in 1918 continues to speak to us across the decades, if we know how to look at it. It tells us not just about Lieutenant William Harrison and his deadly secret, but about the nature of war itself, the deceptions both large and small that it necessitates, the moral boundaries it blurs, the human costs that extend far beyond the battlefield, and the official casualty lists. I've had the photograph professionally restored and enlarged. It hangs now on my study wall, where the 5 faces look out at me as I work: Jenkins, Harrison, or Hartzman, Cooper, Dawson, O'Brien, 2 dead within days of the picture being taken, the others carrying the secret through their post-war lives. Sometimes late at night I find myself speaking to them, asking questions that their frozen images cannot answer. What were you thinking as you stood there, knowing what you knew? Did you suspect, as you posed for posterity, that your secret would eventually come to light? Did you imagine that a century later, someone would still care about what happened in those final days of the war? There's a certain responsibility that comes with uncovering hidden histories like this one. The story of these 5 soldiers and the secret of the second one's uniform deserves to be told, but it also raises questions about how we remember the past and those who shaped it. Wilhelm Hartzman was, by any legal definition, a spy who committed murder to protect his cover. Yet there's something almost admirable in the skill and courage his deception required. To live behind enemy lines, surrounded by those who would kill you if they discovered your true identity, demands a kind of courage different from but perhaps equal to that required on the battlefield. Cooper, who discovered the truth and died for it, exemplifies a different kind of courage, the determination to expose deception regardless of personal risk. His death, just 1 day before the armistice, carries a special poignancy. So close to surviving the war, yet denied that survival because he glimpsed a truth someone else was determined to keep hidden. Jenkins, Dawson, and O'Brien, who kept the secret after the war, present a more morally ambiguous picture. Did they remain silent out of fear, or from a sense that nothing could be gained by speaking out once the war was over? Did they make a pact among themselves, or did each independently choose silence? Their decisions shaped how this episode of the war would, or would not, be remembered. As I continue my research, I've begun to wonder about other photographs from the Great War, other groups of soldiers smiling grimly for the camera. How many other secrets lie hidden in these images, waiting for someone to notice the telling details? How many other stories have been lost to history because no one examined the second man's uniform closely enough? The power of photography to capture moments in time makes it a vital historical source, but also a potentially deceptive one. We see what the photograph shows us, but not what lies beyond its edges. Before or after the shutter clicked, we see postures and expressions, but not thoughts or intentions. We see uniforms and insignia, but not the hearts beneath them. In the case of our 5 soldiers, the photograph preserves a moment of seeming comradeship that masked a deadly reality. 4 Americans and 1 German spy, united in the frame but divided by national loyalty and deadly secrets. The image tells us nothing of Cooper's suspicions or Hartzman's deception. It shows us nothing of the violence that would soon erupt between them. It is both historical record and historical misdirection. Perhaps that's why my grandfather was so obsessed with this particular photograph. He understood that it contained both truth and lies, revelation and concealment. He knew that to truly understand history, we must look beyond what is immediately visible, must question the official record, must examine the details others overlook. The story of these 5 soldiers and the secret hidden in the second one's uniform is more than a tale of wartime espionage. It's a reminder of how fragile historical truth can be, how easily facts can be buried, how completely certain episodes can disappear from public memory. It's also a reminder of the human dimension of warfare, which gets lost in accounts of troop movements and territorial gains. Behind every statistic, every campaign, every victory or defeat are countless individual stories, tales of courage and cowardice, loyalty and betrayal, chance encounters and fateful decisions. Wilhelm Hartmann's infiltration of the 107th Infantry was, in military terms, a minor intelligence operation that ultimately had no impact on the outcome of the war. The German offensive his intelligence was meant to support never materialized because the armistice intervened. Cooper's murder, coming as it did on the eve of peace, was just one more death in a conflict that claimed millions. Yet there's something about this particular story that continues to haunt me. Perhaps it's the cold calculation of Hartmann's actions, maintaining his cover for months, living among men he was working to defeat, and finally killing to protect his secret. Perhaps it's the tragic timing of Cooper's death, so close to the war's end. Or perhaps it's the silence of the survivors, carrying what they knew, or suspected, through their post-war lives without ever speaking of it publicly. As a historian, I've been trained to maintain emotional distance from my subjects, to analyze events and evidence dispassionately. But I find myself emotionally invested in the fates of these 5 soldiers in ways that go beyond professional curiosity. I want justice for Cooper, though it's far too late for that. I want to know what became of Hartmann after the war. I want to understand why Jenkins, Dawson, and O'Brien chose silence. Most of all, I want their story to be remembered, not just as a footnote in the vast literature of the Great War, but as a human drama that illuminates larger truths about the conflict and its legacy. The photograph of 5 soldiers standing proud in 1918, with the secret hidden in the second one's uniform, deserves its place in our understanding of the war. The centenary of the armistice has come and gone. The last veterans of the Great War have passed away. The conflict has moved from living memory into history, but its consequences continue to shape our world, and its stories, even those that remained hidden for a century, still have the power to move us. I've donated copies of my research materials to several archives, ensuring that the story of these 5 soldiers and the secret of the second one's uniform will be available to future historians. The original photograph remains in my possession, a family heirloom passed down from my grandfather, who somehow knew it contained a story worth preserving. Sometimes when I look at their faces, frozen in time on that November day in 1918, I imagine I can see beyond their stoic expressions to the thoughts beneath. Jenkins, perhaps already suspecting something wasn't right with their lieutenant but unwilling to voice his doubts without proof. Harrison, Hartmann, maintaining his mask of American identity while planning his return to German lines, perhaps wondering if he would survive the war's final days or be exposed before he could escape. Cooper, noticing the discrepancies in Harrison's uniform that would soon lead him to a fatal discovery, his observant tailor's eye picking up what others missed. Dawson, loyal to his comrades but soon to be faced with an impossible moral choice when he found his friend's body. O'Brien, whose diary would preserve the truth for a future generation to discover, his writer's instinct compelling him to record events even when he couldn't fully make sense of them. 5 soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder as the Great War drew to its close. Their story, hidden for a century in the details of a uniform, reminds us that history is never as straightforward as it first appears. Behind every photograph, every document, every official account lie human stories of complexity and contradiction, the true fabric of history, woven from individual lives caught in the sweep of world-changing events. The second soldier from the left looks out from the photograph with calm assurance. His uniform, almost but not quite right, tells a story he never intended to reveal. A story of deception and detection, of secrets kept and discovered, of lives intersecting briefly in the chaos of war before diverging into separate fates. A story hidden in plain sight for over a century, until someone thought to look closely at the uniform of the second soldier from the left. November 1918. 5 soldiers stand proud. The war is nearly over. But for them, the most dangerous days still lie ahead. In a way, the photograph itself is the perfect metaphor for how we remember the Great War. At first glance, we see what we expect to see. 5 American soldiers, comrades in arms, facing the camera with the stoic determination characteristic of their generation. Only when we look more closely, when we examine the details others might miss, does a different reality emerge. How much of our understanding of the past is similarly shaped by what we expect to see, rather than what is actually there? How many stories remain hidden because we haven't asked the right questions or looked in the right places? How many secrets are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice the small discrepancies that reveal larger truths? These are the questions that drive me as a historian, that keep me searching through archives and studying old photographs long after others might have given up. The story of these 5 soldiers and the secret of the second one's uniform reminds me why this work matters. Why uncovering hidden histories is not just an academic exercise, but a way of honoring those whose experiences might otherwise be forgotten. The Great War has faded from living memory, its veterans now all gone, its battles known only through books and memorials. But its echoes continue to reverberate through our world, shaping borders and identities, institutions and ideologies. And its stories, even those that remained buried for a century, still have the power to move and instruct us, to remind us of the human dimension of historical events that can so easily get lost in broader narratives. When I look at the photograph now, knowing what I know about the 5 men it depicts, I see not just a historical artifact, but a window into lives caught in the machinery of war, lives shaped by forces beyond their control, yet still defined by the choices they made under extreme circumstances. Jenkins, who chose silence after the war; Harrison, Hartzman, who lived a lie and killed to protect it; Cooper, who discovered the truth and died for it; Dawson, who found his friend's body and faced an impossible moral dilemma; O'Brien, whose diary preserved the truth for future generations. 5 soldiers in 1918, united in a photograph but divided by secrets and deceptions. Their story, hidden for a century in the details of a uniform, reminds us that history is always more complex, more human, and more morally ambiguous than it first appears. The photograph hangs on my wall, the 5 faces looking out at me as I work. Sometimes I think I can see a shadow pass across Harrison's face, a flicker of the divided loyalties and deadly calculations that defined his war. Sometimes I imagine I can see in Cooper's eyes a hint of the suspicion that would lead to his death. Sometimes I fancy I detect in the expressions of Jenkins, Dawson, and O'Brien a suggestion of the burden they would carry into their post-war lives. Imagination, of course. The photograph shows only what it shows. 5 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, 3 days before the armistice, their futures still unwritten, their secrets still concealed. But the uniform of the second soldier from the left tells a different story to those who know how to read it. A story that reminds us that in war, nothing is ever quite what it seems, and the most revealing truths are often hidden in the smallest details. Wilhelm Hartzmann's fate after the war remains the greatest mystery in this story. If he was indeed the man pictured at the Nazi rally in 1933, what role did he play in the rise of the Third Reich? Did his experience as a spy in the Great War inform his later activities? Did he apply the lessons learned behind American lines to new forms of deception and infiltration? These questions may never be answered definitively. The chaos of World War II and its aftermath, the division of Germany during the Cold War, and the destruction of records during both conflicts have created gaps in the historical record that may be impossible to fill. Yet the mystery itself is part of what makes this story compelling. It reminds us that history is not a closed book with all questions answered, but an ongoing inquiry where new discoveries can reshape our understanding of the past. The story of these 5 soldiers and the secret hidden in the second one's uniform deserves to be remembered not just for its intrinsic drama, but for what it tells us about the nature of war and its long shadows. It reminds us that behind the grand narratives of battles and treaties lie countless individual stories of courage and fear, loyalty and betrayal, choices made under impossible circumstances. It reminds us, too, of the power of small details to reveal larger truths. A button out of place, stitching that doesn't quite match, insignia attached with slightly different thread. These minute discrepancies in Harrison's uniform eventually led Cooper to discover his true identity. In the same way, historical truth often emerges not from grand pronouncements but from careful attention to details that others might overlook. As the centenary of the Great War recedes and the conflict slips further into history, stories like this one become more, not less, important. They keep alive the human dimension of a war that transformed the world, that destroyed empires and created nations, that killed millions and scarred millions more. The photograph of 5 soldiers standing proud in 1918 connects us to that distant time, makes it immediate and human in ways that statistics and battle maps cannot. Their faces, Jenkins, Harrison, Hartzman, Cooper, Dawson, O'Brien, remind us that history is not an abstraction, but the sum of individual lives caught up in events beyond their control, yet shaped by the choices they made. And the secret hidden in the second one's uniform reminds us that history is never as straightforward as it first appears, that beneath the surface of official narratives lie hidden stories waiting to be discovered by those willing to look closely enough. 5 soldiers in 1918 stand proud, until you examine the second one's uniform. A story of deception and detection, of secrets kept and discovered, of lives intersecting briefly in the chaos of war before diverging into separate fates. A story that reminds us why history matters, why the search for hidden truths is never wasted effort, why the past continues to speak to us if we know how to listen. The war to end all wars ended over a century ago, but its shadows still stretch into our present. And sometimes, the most revealing historical documents are not the official records or the general's memoirs, but a simple photograph of 5 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder 3 days before the guns fell silent. In that photograph, and in the secret hidden in the second one's uniform, lies a story that deserves to be told. A story that reminds us of the human dimension of historical events, of the moral complexity of wartime choices, of the thin line between friend and enemy in a world torn apart by conflict. A story that reminds us, too, that history is never fully known, that new discoveries can reshape our understanding of the past, that the search for historical truth is an ongoing process rather than a completed task. 5 soldiers. 1 photograph, a secret hidden in plain sight for over a century. Their story, like the war itself, belongs not just to the past, but to our present and future as well. For in understanding their experiences, the deceptions and discoveries, the moral choices and their consequences, we gain insight not just into the Great War, but into the human condition itself. The photograph hangs on my wall, a window into a world now gone, but not forgotten. 5 faces look out at me across the decades, their expressions betraying nothing of what was to come. But the uniform of the second soldier from the left tells a story to those who know how to read it. A story of war and espionage, of identity and deception, of secrets kept for a century but finally brought to light. A story that reminds us why we study history, not just to know what happened, but to understand the human experiences that lie beneath the surface of events. A story that reminds us, too, that the past is never as distant as it seems, that its echoes continue to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. 5 soldiers in 1918 stand proud. Their story, hidden in the details of a uniform, speaks to us still. In the fading light of my study, I carefully return the photograph to its album. The faces of those 5 men, Jenkins, Harrison, Hartzman, Cooper, Dawson, O'Brien, linger in my mind. Their story, hidden for so long in the details of a uniform, has become part of my own story, a quest that has consumed years of my life. Was it worth it? To spend so much time and effort uncovering a secret that, in the grand scheme of the Great War, might seem insignificant? A German spy who infiltrated an American unit, a murder on the eve of the armistice, a secret kept by the survivors. These are footnotes in a conflict that reshaped the world. Yet I believe it was worth it. Not just for the intrinsic fascination of the story itself, but for what it tells us about the nature of war, about the moral complexity of human choices under extreme circumstances, about the way history is both preserved and distorted by those who live through it, and perhaps most importantly, for what it tells us about the importance of looking closely at the evidence before us, of questioning the official record, of seeking the hidden stories that lie beneath the surface of historical events. The secret hidden in the second soldier's uniform reminds us that history is never as straightforward as it first appears, that the most revealing truths are often found in the smallest details, that the past continues to speak to us if we know how to listen. 5 soldiers in 1918 stand proud until you examine the second one's uniform. Their story, hidden for a century but finally brought to light, reminds us why history matters. not as a collection of dates and facts to be memorized, but as a living connection to the human experiences that have shaped our world. A connection that allows us, across the vast gulf of time, to look into the faces of 5 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in the final days of the Great War, and to glimpse something of their hopes and fears, their secrets and their sacrifices, their place in the machinery of history. Their story deserves to be told, not just as a footnote in the vast literature of the war, but as a human drama that illuminates larger truths about the conflict and its legacy. The photograph of 5 soldiers standing proud in 1918, with the secret hidden in the second one's uniform, deserves its place in our understanding of the past. For in that understanding lies not just knowledge of what happened, but insight into who we are and how we came to be. The shadows of the Great War still stretch into our present. And sometimes, the most revealing historical documents are not the official records or the general's memoirs, but a simple photograph of 5 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder 3 days before the guns fell silent. November 1918. 5 soldiers stand proud. The war is nearly over, but their story, a tale of deception, murder, and secrets buried for a century, is just beginning. The second soldier from the left, William Harrison, or rather Wilhelm Hartzmann, stares out from the photograph with eyes that seem to challenge us across the decades. What do you really know about me? Those eyes seem to ask. What do you really know about the war, about loyalty, about survival? His gaze reminds me of something a professor once told me when I was a graduate student, just beginning my career as a historian. "The past is a foreign country," he said, quoting L.P. Hartley. "They do things differently there. Never assume you understand their choices until you've walked in their shoes." I've tried to walk in Hartzmann's shoes, to imagine what it must have been like to live behind enemy lines, to wear a false identity like a second skin, to form relationships with men you were deceiving, men whose deaths might result from the information you gathered. I've tried to understand the moral calculus that would lead a man to kill a comrade who had discovered his secret, even as the war was ending. I don't condone his actions, but I recognize their human complexity, their embeddedness in a particular historical moment and a particular set of circumstances.